We're still in the season of Easter. It's a season that is really about getting at the core of what it means to live in Jesus' new life. He died and he was raised to new life so that we can die to sin and be raised to a new life with him. And we have new life because Jesus was raised. And so each week what we're doing is kind of looking at some aspect of that newness, right? That new life. The word new is our focus for every week during Easter. And today we're looking at 1 John. And John tells us that Jesus gave us a new commandment. And he says that following Jesus means obeying him. And especially in that new commandment. Now, this letter, 1 John is a letter, and this letter is really about the simplicity of the gospel and the simplicity of what it means to follow Jesus. To follow Jesus means obeying him, and obeying means loving God and loving people. Like, that's it. Like, you got that, right? Like, follow Jesus, obey him, love God, love people. That's what he calls us to do. I mean, that we do what he does. We learn to walk just as he walks. But we do these things, we obey Jesus, not because of some kind of like force that comes from outside of us, not because of fear, not because of him telling us what we got to do, but because of an internal drive to follow Jesus that is motivated by our love for him. And so what I want to do, I want to just look at 1 John with you. It's a letter, 1 John, and you know there's a lot of letters in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul wrote the majority of those letters, but we also have 3 letters that are written by the Apostle John, who is the son of Zebedee, one of the disciples of Jesus, and the brother of James. So John, son of Zebedee, is one of Jesus' disciples, brother of James. He's one of those original disciples, usually considered the youngest of the disciple. Sometimes he's called the beloved disciple. And John wrote 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Or at least we think that John wrote them. There is no author identified in these letters. The title across the top is something that was added a little bit later. There's no statement at the beginning like you find if you look at Paul's letters where he says, I, the Apostle Paul, write to you in Corinth or in Rome or in Thessalonica. Sometimes Paul will say who he is with. He say, I'm writing with Sosthenes. I'm writing with Timothy, right? So he clearly identifies who he is at the beginning when you look at Paul's letters. At the end of Paul's letters, he clearly says, say hello to. And like Romans, there's a huge list of people that he knows, and he says, send greetings to them. But John doesn't have any of that, right? It just kind of launches in, and in fact, it ends with this really blunt line. If you look at this, the very last line of 1 John says, Dear children, keep yourselves from idols, period. That's it, right? There's no nice to talk to you or anything like that. It's just this kind of, that is the ending of the letters. We think that John was the writer of these letters. The early church understood that it was John the disciple who wrote them, and it kind of makes sense because whoever wrote them figured that they were a known quantity, right? You don't have to identify yourself by much if you are well known within the church. So 2nd and 3rd John both begin by saying the elder to and then it gives some more details. But the elder, it's like, he is the elder. He doesn't have to tell you which one. John, the elder. It's just like in other places, there's James. It just identifies, I'm James, the brother of Jesus, or Jude, or it's the Apostle Paul. You don't have to say, which Paul was that? Which James? People know, right? This is the elder. His reputation precedes him. And I don't know, have you ever searched your own name on the internet? Just type your own name into the search bar and see what pops up. And one thing you might discover is that there's other people that have your name. So I've done that, right? There's a Brad Roth who's a professor of law. Seems like a pretty successful guy. There's a Brad Roth who's a businessman in Lincoln. There's also a Brad Roth who died in a motorcycle accident a couple of years ago, which is weird to read an obituary using your name, right? But and there's a Brad Roth who's a Mennonite pastor in Milford, Nebraska, so I don't know how that all shakes out. But I am the Brad Roth, right? Well, this is the John, son of Zebedee. This is the elder, right? He is the apostle who needs no introduction and none is given, right? The letter of John. Now, if anything, in this letter, if anything is John's claim to fame, you see this in 1 John 1:1-4. And he says that he's giving the testimony to that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and touched with our hands. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. So let me interpret that for you. It's 1 John 1-4. John is saying, don't pay attention to me just because I am the John, the son of Zebedee. Don't pay attention to me just because I was a disciple. Listen to me, because what I have to say connects with Jesus, who I met in the flesh. Jesus, the Word incarnate. Jesus, the one that I followed for years. That is why you should listen to me, because I saw, heard, touched, and walked with him. That's what John says. He's pointing back to Jesus. He starts his letter off like that. And in one way, that's John's teaching in this entire letter, and all three of these letters. I mean, it's all back to Jesus. It is all about following Jesus. It's all back to obeying what Jesus says. That's the simple beauty of these letters. Follow Jesus, and everything else is gravy. Now, we're looking at chapter 2. If you want to just read this with me, just look at this with me. Chapter 2, verse 3, we know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. The him there is Jesus. We have come to know him. That's Jesus. We've come to know him if we obey his commandments. And that really lays out what John is teaching here, and it's really what the whole letter is about. To know Jesus is to obey his commandments. And seems pretty simple, right? Like, followers of Jesus should do what Jesus says. I mean, what else would it mean to follow Jesus, right? You can believe the right things. You can do the right rituals. You can be affiliated with all the right people. You can have all these good and important and true things about your life that connect you to practicing your faith. But there's a way in which being a Christian comes down to this basic question: are you following Jesus? Are you obeying Jesus' commands? I mean, I think this is one of those things that the early Anabaptists talked a lot about, right? Our spiritual ancestors, the umbrella group that the Mennonite faith came out of 500 years ago when the Reformation was breaking out across Europe. We call these people Anabaptists. They folks like Michael Sattler or Menno Simons, Conrad Grebel, this is kind of their key point. They said, look, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, then you got to do what Jesus says. I was just reading something by Menno Simons. That's the Menno and Mennonite, right? I was just reading something by him last night, and he says, shame on you, to some other pastors. He says, shame on you for your carefree and easy faith. If you see people who are hungry and you're not doing anything about it, are you really following Jesus? I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but like this was kind of their point, that to follow Jesus means to follow Jesus, right? You got to actually do the stuff. It's the simplicity of faith. That's a basic stance. And it's kind of like one of the little gems, I think, of the Mennonite faith, right? If you're a follower of Jesus, then follow Jesus, obey him. And I mean, this can get really easily into reductionist territory. I mean, we can kind of make the mistake of hearing this and saying like, oh, well, nothing else matters, right? Like doctrine doesn't matter. We can make this mistake. Doctrine doesn't matter. Worship doesn't matter. Affiliation doesn't matter. None of that matters. Just follow Jesus. I mean, I don't think it's that reductionist. But there is a way in which obeying Jesus is basic to what it means to be a Christian. We have come to know him, says John, if we have obeyed his commands. And then John flips that around. Look at verse 4. The man who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is in him. Right? If we obey Jesus, then we're following. If we're following him, otherwise it's something hypocritical. Verse 5, it kind of lays that out a little bit further. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him. Right? So again, obey Jesus. God's love is complete in us. Verse 6, whoever claims to live in him must walk just as he walks. And it comes down to verse 7. Dear friends, I'm not writing to you a new commandment, but an old one which you have had since the beginning. This old commandment is the message that you have heard. It's this new old commandment. Back in John 13, the Gospel of John, Jesus said there, when he was in the upper room with his disciples, this is what we read and studied on Maundy Thursday. When he knows he's going to die soon, his time is short, he says, I am giving you a new commandment. He says, this is my new commandment, that you love one another. He says that just as I have loved you, you should love one another. He says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, by the love that you have for one another. They will know you are Christians by your love. And this is really important, because to obey Jesus is it's first of all to obey this basic command that he gives of loving one another. It's got its roots all the way in the Old Testament. Jesus said that the greatest commandments of the Old Testament, they were to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. And in that way, it's really an old commandment, right? It goes all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and what we call the Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. I mean, that is it right there. Love God. And then Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus pulls those two together. They are the most fundamental, ancient, old commandments of the Bible. They're always at the heart of the law that God gave. And here's Jesus saying, I'm reiterating that. It's his new old commandment. He's given it in John. It's the bedrock of this life with him. The new life in Jesus ought to be characterized by love. That's what Jesus said. That's what John is getting at here. He's pointing back to Jesus. We've got to be following that new old commandment to love. I mean, if you look at 1 John, this is one of the reasons that 1 John is such a beloved letter. You look at 1 John and you see that it is all about love, right? 1 John 4:8, God is love. 1 John 4:16, God is love, and those who abide in him and his love abide in God, and God abides in them. 1 John 5:2, we know that we love the children of God when we love God and we obey his commandments, right? So I could go on, right? There's all of this love. There's just tons of brotherly love in 1 John, and there's this emphasis. It's like this basic command of being a Christian. It is love. So have you ever seen those like t-shirts that say, but first coffee? Do you know what I'm talking about, right? Sometimes like ... but first coffee. Maybe you live by that motto. I don't know, but it's like, I'm ready to conquer the day, to go out and do something, to be big in the world, but first coffee. That, unfortunately, at this stage of my life, with a 3-year-old, that really works for me. Like a daily dose of coffee, I'm kind of like always trying to figure out like just that amount that I need to get up and moving, but not kind of overdo it so I can get back to sleep at night. But first coffee, right? Well, I think we could kind of adapt this a little bit. We could say, when you're thinking about the Christian faith, when you're thinking about what it means to follow Jesus, when you're thinking about the scriptures and worship and discipleship and everything, first love. But first love, right? Just say that with me. But first love, right? Read the Bible. But first love, right? Pray. But first love. Say it with me. Worship God. But first love. Believe the truth of the gospel. But first love, right? You could do this all day. That everything starts with that love. God has loved us first. Jesus has shown us what that love looks like, and we are called to love God, to love our neighbors. It all starts with following that primordial command, love. But first, love. To be a Christian is to love. They will know that we are Christians by our love. It's that new old commandment, love. And it is so simple, but it is oh so hard. Right? I want to call us back to that today, right? It's just a simple message because we're looking at what it means to live this new life in Jesus every week, the new. And we're looking at that new life of resurrection, but it's characterized by that life of love, but first love. When we're talking about God, what that means is having our hearts set on him. It means having all the other loves of our lives ordered toward God. It means that when we worship, we are singing our hearts out in love for him. It means that when we pray, we are entering into the presence of God, not because of what we think he can do for us, but because of the love that we have for him. It means that when we come to the scriptures, we're not just reading it for the history and the doctrine and as a curious ancient book, but because of the love of God that is pouring through us. We see it as a love letter. We study the Bible and learn all those ins and outs of the Bible because we love the one who wrote it. And in one way, loving God, get this, loving God is easy in one way. Because God's good. Who wouldn't love perfect goodness? God loved us first. Who wouldn't love the one who has first loved us? God sent Jesus. Who wouldn't love the one who has died for us? God has our best interest in mind. It's easy to love God in that way. In one way, who wouldn't love God, right? What's hard is loving other people. Am I right? That ought to get me an amen, right? What's hard is loving other people. It is hard to love other people. It's easy to love people in the abstract, to say something like, I care about the poor, right? Or I care about refugees. And those can be true statements, but it gets more complicated when we start talking about loving somebody who is right there in front of us, asking for help, or we're called to help a particular immigrant family, maybe who doesn't practice our same faith tradition or believe like we do. We can say, love your neighbor as yourself, and we can kind of all sign off on that, right? Love your neighbor, that sounds really good. But then what if you don't have a good neighbor, right? What if you're interacting with folks who are difficult, who don't treat you right? Then it gets more complicated, right? As someone has said, it's easy to love the lovable. It's hard to love the unlovable, or at least those who make it more difficult sometimes for whatever reason to love them. And even sometimes the people who are closest to us, the ones that we love the most, sometimes they can be the most difficult, right? Or at least, I've heard that from friends, right? Sometimes it can be hard to love like that family member or whatever, right? That person that maybe you've got some history with, that maybe you've gone around before about politics or life or whatever it is. Sometimes it can be hard to love them. And I think this is why Jesus makes love a command. Loving others doesn't depend on how we feel about them at any given moment. That's going to be up and down and all over the place. There are different kinds of love that are mentioned in the New Testament. The one that's mentioned here, this is agape love. Maybe you've heard of that. Agape. It's sometimes called brotherly love or sisterly love. Agape love is not about feeling desire for another person. That is eros love. It's not about feeling warm attraction to another person. That is philos love. Agape love is about willing the good of another. You can't command feelings. You can't command eros. You can't command philos. You can't command feelings. But you can command willing the good of another. But even though it is a command, we have to notice what kind of a command it is. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says that to those who received him, he gave the right to be called children of God. That's how the gospel begins. And throughout 1 John, John says that we are God's children. Right? He says everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Right? We're God's children. We're born of God. Look at 2:1. He starts off, my dear children. Look at 2:12. He says, dear children. Right? I write to you, dear children. Look at 3:1. He says, how great is the love that the Father has lavished on us that we should be called what? Children of God. Right? You know that song, right? Behold what manner of love the Father, right, has given unto us that we should be called children of God. We are God's children, and so to love as a child, listen to this, to love as a child is different than to love as a servant. Jesus gives it as a command, but it is a command to children, right? Our obedience to God comes from this place of being a child of God, of having that love steered towards God. Comes from a place of God, of that loving relationship that we have with God. We are those who follow Jesus more and more, even in the hard things, because our love for him is growing more and more. That's what makes it possible for us to love him truly and do what he says, because we've got that love right here that he has implanted in us. And I think one of the great arcs of our lives, one of the things that we want to see in our lives as followers of Jesus, a little test that we can give ourselves is this: am I growing more and more in the obedience that comes from love? Right? Check yourself. Think about yourself. Where were you at when you were a teenager, when you were a young adult, when you're in your 30s, 40s, however far you could stretch that out, 50s, 60s, 70s? Where were you at? Are you growing more in obedience that comes from love of Christ? Right? It's one of those things that we should be constantly growing in and looking back and being able to say, at the beginning, I obeyed Jesus because I had to, but I obey him now because I want to, right? Out of love. We should be growing in such a way that the love of God is made manifest in our lives without us even knowing it, right? We're acting for love of God because it's become second nature to us. We don't even have to try. You can tell when someone's trying too hard, right? Especially when someone's trying too hard to love, you can just see that, right? You know what I'm talking about. Like, you shouldn't even call it trying to love, really, because it's something different. It's like trying too hard to be nice. And there's a word for this. When you're trying too hard to be nice, it's not a compliment. It's called obsequious, right? When someone's being obsequious, they're trying so hard to act like they care that you can feel like they don't actually care, right? There's something that just feels a little bit off. Something it's a false note in there that's sounded. And usually it's because you can sense them kind of trying to work up this emotional energy of love, but it's just not there for them. It's not working. And this is why authentic love of God and neighbor doesn't come from a place of feeling, but from a place of willing the good of another, right? None of us is really capable of working that love up. It's just going to come off as false. But any of us is capable of willing the good of another. So what does that love look like? Well, this is not rocket science. Let's flip over to another verse. Look at chapter 3, 17 and 18 with me. What does this love look like? Here's John. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother or sister in need but has no pity on him or her, how can the love of God be in him? Here it is. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth, right? He's saying, don't just say you love, do it. Go do something concrete in action and in truth. It's doing something that's concrete to show care for another. And I'm gonna expand this. I'm gonna make it 3 things: in deeds and in words and in spirit. That's what you do. He's saying, go do it in truth. That's the breakdown of love. Deeds, words, spirit. Now here John's putting the emphasis on deeds, right? If someone is in need and you know that you can help, there are times where it's like, I can't meet that need for whatever reason. But if someone's in need, you know you can help, then to love that person means helping. That's it. Right? This is the same point that James was getting at in his letter. If you want to see what faith in action looks like, go and read James. James says he doesn't want to hear about faith that doesn't have works. He says faith without works is dead. He says, if you can show me faith without works, I will demonstrate by my works that I have faith. And James says, if someone is in need, what good is it to say, go in peace, keep warm, eat your fill, and not supply their bodily needs? James says, and John's echoing him here, look, you want to show love? Do something. Yeah, we got to have wisdom about what we do. Sometimes people ask for things, and it's like, I'm not sure that would be the most healthy thing for me to do, that need to meet. But the basic first step, our basic stance as followers of Jesus is do something. Second thing, we show love in our words too, right? Deeds and words. It's Ephesians 4:15. Speak the truth in love. And that is really hard to get right. Speak the truth in love. I know I have gotten that wrong 1,000 times because it is always kind of easy and sort of admired in our culture to be the person who just says it like it is, right? I say it like it is. Emphasis on the truth, but to not say things with love. And this speaking the truth in love is more than just saying things in a nice way, though. That's not a bad place to start. Speaking the truth in love is about making sure that what we are saying is seeking the good of another. right? We want to build others up. And there may be hard truths that we feel compelled to speak, but we speak them because we believe that what we are doing and saying will help the other person. And so I think this is also just speaking with kindness, but it's also noticing the goodness of others. It is believing the best about another person. It is seeking ways to encourage them. And I don't mean flattery when we talk about encouragement. Flattery is saying nice things in order to get a person to like us or to do something for us. But I think genuine encouragement is different. It's really paying attention to a person deeply enough to see truly the goodness that is in them, their giftedness, the life that God has gifted them, to see what makes them tick, and seeking to name those things in their life and then to call forth more of that goodness. That's encouragement. True encouragement is saying, may you live, at root, may you live more and more into who God has made you to become. And we show love in our spirit, right? So deeds, word, spirit. For me, there are two basic ways that we show love in the spirit, and they're really straightforward. The first is that we pray for people. You can do this sometimes without them knowing. You see a need, you see something happening, you pray. I hear the sirens going off, I pause and I pray, right? I don't know who they are, what's going on. I know some of you have the gift of intercessory prayer, and you'll know if you have that gift, or even if you've just spent time in intercessory prayer, that as you sit with God in silence, there will be moments where God will just come and lay someone on your mind. Take that as an opportunity to pray for that person or situation. You'll just be sitting there very quietly. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. You're with God, you're seeking God, and God will just kind of bring somebody to mind for you. Maybe somebody you haven't thought about for a really long time. The other day I was having a hard day. I got a text out of the blue from somebody that lives in North Dakota. Somebody I've interacted with on rural church stuff, and he said, I was thinking of you today, and I prayed for you, right? Just do that. When you got that, when God lays somebody on your mind, pray for them. You just offer prayer. And sometimes that can also be in person. You'll meet someone, you'll be talking to someone, there'll be a hard situation, and you can just think to yourself, I can pray about this. And sometimes you can be so bold as to say, would it be okay if I prayed for you right now? We can be bashful about prayer, but folks, this is a gift that we bring as followers of Jesus. We are the children of God, and we have this privilege of coming before the Father, the creator of all. We can just offer this. Can we pray for you? And I think the other thing that we can do to show love in the Spirit is to practice presence. And I think this can be one of the greatest gifts, and it can go hand in hand with prayer. It's one of the greatest gifts, but it's also one of the most overlooked, the gift of presence. We just sit with someone who's sick. We visit someone in jail. We take the time to really hear somebody out. Those are gifts. And they come from that greater gift of presence. To be present is allowing our spirit to be with the spirit of another. And then it's also acknowledging that both of our spirits are held by the Holy Spirit of God. You can be present to someone, whether they're aware of it or not. They might be totally unconscious because they're sick. You just with them. You can be present to someone who has had tremendous loss, and maybe there's no words that you can offer. There's no way to fix it, but you're just with them. You're present. So it's deeds, it's words, it's spirit. These are concrete ways that we show love to one another. I know that you have all practiced these things at various times. You've all done them. I'm just reminding you. We show love through deed, word, and spirit. It's that new, old commandment. And for John, when we're doing this, when we obey Jesus and follow him and love God and love others, when we're doing this very simple thing, it's taken us to a very deep place. Because John says that in obeying Jesus, that is an act of love, and that to love Jesus is to know him. This is why love of neighbor and love for God, they are bound together, because when we obey Jesus by showing love to someone else, we are actually opening up a doorway to knowing Jesus more deeply. Think about Matthew 25, when they fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, visited those in prison, all that. They said, when? Jesus said, whenever you did this to the least of these, you did it to me, right? It's this opening up a doorway to know Jesus more deeply by showing love to another. We're loving Jesus through them. We're coming to know Jesus more deeply as we love that other person. To love is to know. Brothers and sisters, here we are in this Easter season. We are the people renewed by Jesus' resurrection, and Jesus is calling us out to do this old new thing, the oldest thing of all, to love God, to love one another, and in doing that, to walk just as he walked.